Finally, my final Big Coup interview is with Oscar-winning filmmaker John G. Avildsen, who has been behind many surprisingly zeitgeist films, starting with Joe from 1970, kind of one of the first, if not the first, Revenge of the Working Man films that have come out periodically throughout the years, with an iconic performance by Peter Boyle. Also, Save the Tiger with Jack Lemmon's Oscar-winning performance as a World War II veteran, disillusioned by this seemingly out-of-touch generation. Then, of course, Rocky, and then also The Karate Kid and Lean on Me. We cover a lot of territory on the Rocky series, but first we begin on what drew him to filmmaking. Here's my interview with John G. Avildsen. Well, before we get into Rocky, let me ask you this: what drew you to filmmaking?
It just seemed like more fun than working.
Was this when did you first get interested in filmmaking?
In about 1959.
Okay. Right. And did you have? I guess the obvious question: did you have connections in the business, or how did you break in?
No. I was up until then. I was interested in advertising, and my dream was to have my own advertising agency by the time I was 30. And in '59, I was working in an advertising agency in New York, and the guy I was working for, he dreamed about making movies. And at the time I got drafted, he went to Italy and worked for Fellini and Antonioni on a couple of their movies. And when he came back in '61, I was getting out of the Army, and he made his first movie, and I worked for him. And that's when I was bitten.
Mm-hmm. And were you a movie person just as a kid?
Well, my dad made home movies, and I grew up with holding up little signs that said the date and the place. And my dad was making home movies long before I was born. Mm-hmm. So cameras and stuff were things that were very familiar to me.
Right. Well, before we get to Rocky, I want to talk about one film that's a real personal favorite of mine, and that's Save the Tiger. And what do you remember of that experience of making that?
Well, Save the Tiger was the first movie I made out here in Hollywood. Mm-hmm. It was the first movie that I directed where I wasn't my own cameraman.
Right.
And it was the first movie I made with a big Hollywood star, Jack Lemmon. Mm-hmm. I had the good fortune of a great script by Steve Shagan, wrote it and also produced the movie, and has become a very close friend. Mm-hmm. So the whole experience was a very happy one. And the movie was a very sad movie. And not many people went to it because I think it was so sad. But it has a loyal following, and I was very pleased with how it turned out.
Right, and as you said, it has a loyal following, and at the time and even now, it's one of those films that certain people, know about. So were you kind of startled when that film got the award recognition that it did, seeing that not many people went to it at the time?
Well, the recognition that counts is at the box office, and it never got that kind of recognition. But it certainly is satisfying when people like yourself talk about it in glowing terms.
Right. And was Jack Lemmon, the veteran, Billy Wilder, and all these other directors, and you said this was your first major film you made out in Hollywood. Was he an actor who was excited working with,
well,
talent?
When I came out here to audition for Jack Lemmon, went to his house for dinner one evening, and I said, I've always been a fan of yours, but if you select me to direct this, I don't want to see you in it. And he said, that's right, kid. He said, you keep your eyes open. He understood that I didn't want him doing all his mannerisms and all the stuff that he had gotten used to doing. I wanted him to become Harry Stoner, this character in Steve's script. Mm-hmm. And I would call cut, and if he saw that I wasn't happy, he'd say, "You want me to do it without the eyebrow?" And I'd say, "Yeah. Why don't you try it without the eyebrow?" Then once the picture was finished, the studio wanted to change the cut, and Steve Shagan and I sort of kidnapped the print, and took it over to Rome, where Jack was working with Billy Wilder on
Avanti, right?
Avanti, right? Very good. And we showed it to Jack in hopes that he would like it, and if he did, then the studio would leave it alone. So one rainy afternoon, we ended up in a little screening room outside of Rome, and Jack was there with Billy Wilder, and the film was still in separate picture and track, and we screened the picture. And when the picture was over, the lights came up in this little screening room, and nobody said anything, and Billy Wilder said, "Well, there's only one thing wrong with this." And I thought to myself, "Oh, God, now what?" And he said, "I didn't make it." So that couldn't have been nicer. And he was just, Billy Wilder was just the best. And just been seeing some of his pictures recently on Netflix, and he certainly knew how to do it.
Well, and I'll ask one more question about say, the Tiger. And if the story I heard, if it's true or not, is it true that there was one scene that was taken out of the film that at either Wilder's or Lemon's suggestion about Harry Stoner going to see his mistress?
Yeah, in the original story, before he goes to the factory, mm-hmm. He stops and visits his mistress in the Hollywood Hills, and I don't think it was in the cut that went to Rome for Jack and Billy Wilder to see. I think it ended up on the floor beforehand, and the reason was it just sort of slowed the picture down, and it didn't really add much, and because the picture really starts when he arrives at the factory.
Right. Well, now it's 1973, and then 3 years later, you're on Rocky. How did you get involved with the Rocky project?
An old friend of mine, Gene Kirkwood, called me and said he had this boxing script, and I explained to him that I wasn't interested in boxing. I thought it was a silly thing to do, and he said, "No, please read this. I think you'll like it." And I had just come back from Malta, where I'd gone to scout locations for a picture that was going to star Richard Burton. But before we got a chance to begin to shoot it, the production company ran out of money, so I was gainfully unemployed, and Gene prevailed on me, and I started reading the script. On the second or third page, Rocky's talking to his turtles, Cuff and Link, and I was charmed. I thought it was a great character study and beautiful love story, and boxing was just the background, like the Civil War was the background to Gone with the Wind. So I never really thought it was about boxing. I thought it was a very well-crafted character study. Mm-hmm. Sylvester's a good screenwriter.
Yeah, obviously. And so when you came on, I mean, obviously, so was it already set when you came on that, you know, not only did he write this, but he's going to be the star and it's going to be this low-budget film?
Yes. He had, Gene was working for Chertoff and Winkler. I had worked for Chertoff and Winkler a few years before, trying to save one of their turkeys. They hired me after I did Joe for a couple of weeks of shooting to try to improve this picture they had. I don't think anything could have improved it, but I certainly didn't turn down the opportunity. Mm-hmm. And that's when I met Gene and got Gene a job with Chertoff and Winkler. And while he was working there, he met Sylvester, and he brought Sylvester into Chertoff and Winkler as an actor. And they interviewed him, and as he was leaving, Sylvester said, "Oh, by the way, I also write scripts." And they said, "Okay, well, why don't you send one along?" So he did, and they read the script, and they liked it. And they said, "We'd like to buy this." And Sylvester explained that script, which was Paradise Alley, had already been sold, but he could write another script. And they said, "Okay." So he went away, and a week later he came back with Rocky. Mm-hmm. Rocky was written in a very short amount of time. Mm-hmm. And they liked it, and he said, "Okay, but I'm only going to sell it to you if I star in it." And they said, "Oh, be serious. We'll get a movie star to star in it. Somebody like Ryan O'Neal or Burt Reynolds or somebody." And he said, "Nope. If you want this script, I star." And fortunately, he prevailed, and they said, "Okay, but it's going to be done for less than $1 million." And I had a reputation for making low-budget movies that didn't go over budget, and how that came to be. And we made it for less than $1 million, and it was shot in 28 days.
And what about? I guess we'll talk a little bit about the casting, and that it's under $1 million, so you have sort of relative, for the most part, you have relative unknowns. But I'll ask it. So, what was the process of getting Burgess Meredith for a supporting role?
Well, I had met Burgess Meredith on Hurry Sundown when I worked for Otto Preminger in 1964.
Right.
We became friends, and when it came to the part of Mickey, one person who came in to read was Lee J. Cobb. But he wouldn't read. He wouldn't audition. Mm-hmm. He said, if you want somebody to read, get a radio actor. But Burgess didn't have that kind of ego, and he didn't mind reading. And when he came in to read, as I would often do, I would say after the actor read the scene, I said, "Okay, now put the script away and let's do it again and just improvise it. You know what the beats are in the scene." So the scene that we auditioned the Mickey character for was where Rocky comes and complains that he's being thrown out of his locker. Mm-hmm. So we went through it without the script, and at the end of the scene, as Rocky goes to leave, Burgess says, "Hey, Rock, have you ever thought about retiring?" Well, that wasn't in the script. And Sylvester said, "No." And Burgess said, "Well, start thinking about it." And I thought, that's perfect. You got it. And that's how we got the part.
And through those auditions, did he add that kind of gravelly, growly voice?
Yes, he brought that to the party.
Hmm. And what about some of the other actors? I mean, Talia Shire, obviously from the Godfather films, but was a supporting player, and
Well,
Burt
Carrie
Young.
Snodgrass had that part originally, but had the Adrian part, but her agent wanted too much money.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the end of Carrie Snodgrass, and I had seen Godfather and thought she was terrific in that.
Mm-hmm.
She came in to read, and that was the end of that story.
Mm-hmm.
Talia was absolutely terrific.
Right.
Thank goodness Carrie Snodgrass was greedy.
And what is it that Burt Young brought to the role of Paulie?
Burt Young was a favorite of Arthur Krim, who was one of the heads of United Artists at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And Arthur Krim suggested Burt for the part. And Burt and I had almost met years before, and when I made my first picture for a fellow in New York called Leonard Kirkman, who made low-budget exploitation pictures. And Burt had worked for him. Burt had been a house painter, and Leonard needed somebody in his movie, and that actor didn't show up one day, so Leonard went next door where the apartment was being painted. There was Burt, and said, "Come in here, and you can play this part," and a star was born.
And finally, I guess Carl Weathers. I heard that it was going to be Ken Norton, but he fell through. Is that true?
Yeah, Ken Norton was up for it, but I think he decided to go back into fighting, or again, he may have wanted too much money, and Carl came in to read, and he didn't know that Sylvester had written the thing. He didn't know who Sylvester was, so Sylvester read opposite Carl, and Carl said, I could do a lot better with this part if you got a regular actor for me to read against. And we all liked that kind of arrogance, and we thought that was perfect for Apollo Creed, and Carl got the part. And he was...
And so, in the production of this film, was it? I guess it was a 28-day shoot. I mean, it's almost like an indie film. Was the production, even though it was low budget and a short schedule, did you feel that you were getting what you wanted, or did you feel rushed, or both?
Nope. I was very pleased with the production. When we started planning it, I said, well, we got to go to Philadelphia to shoot some of this stuff. And the producers said, no, we can't go to Philadelphia. We can't afford that kind of location. And I said, no, we don't have to bring a big Hollywood crew to Philadelphia. I've got a non-union, low-budget crew that I've made a number of pictures in New York with. They can come to Philadelphia, and we can make the picture, we can shoot all the exteriors there, and nobody will be the wiser. So I can convince them of that. And the first date where Rocky and Adrian go out was originally written where they go to a little restaurant and sit at a table and talk for about 10 pages or whatever it was. And I said, you don't want two people looking at each other in a static situation, talking, and can really be deadly. Maybe they go bowling, or maybe they go ice skating, and that way it won't be so static. So we decided that they would go ice skating. And in downtown Philadelphia, there's a little outdoor rink similar to Rockefeller Center in Manhattan. And that's where that scene was going to be shot, with a bunch of people skating around, and we were going to sort of steal it. Well, at a certain point, the producers got cold feet, and they were afraid that we were going to be discovered shooting non-union in Philadelphia, and they said, we got to go back to Hollywood before we get caught. and we'll do the first date scene in Hollywood, and we'll do it in a little restaurant where we won't have a lot of extras to pay. And I said, no, you don't want. Maybe they go skating, and the skating rink is closed, and that's why there are no extras, and we won't have to pay any extras. And Sylvester liked that idea, and he changed a couple of lines in the script, and that's how they came to have their first date in an empty skating rink.
Right. And I'll ask you about, I guess, another scene. The story goes that the big scene where Rocky gets up in the middle of the night to go down to the arena, and then he comes back and he kind of says he can't win, but he wants to go the distance. That the producer's studio, they wanted that scene cut.
No, that scene was originally written the night before the fight. Mm-hmm. Rocky went down to Mickey's gym, and he looked at 16-millimeter footage of Apollo's various fights, and he is so impressed by Apollo's prowess that he realizes that he hasn't got a chance against this guy, and if he goes the distance, then he won't be just another bum from the neighborhood. Mm-hmm. Well, we never had the time or the money to shoot these newsreel footage scenes that Rocky was going to look at. And I also knew that we were never going to have the extras to fill up the sports arena in Los Angeles. So I suggested that instead of going to the gym to look at this footage that we don't have, maybe he goes to the arena the night before the fight when it's empty, and he walks around and we see how huge it is, and he's intimidated by it, and that's what serves to make him realize that he hasn't got a chance against this guy. And at the same time that we were getting ready to shoot the scene at the sports arena, the posters, we had been pleading with the producers to spring for these posters of the two fighters and their poses that were going to be hung at either end of the arena. Well, the trunks that Sylvester was wearing when the Polaroid was taken of him in his boxing pose, those weren't the trunks that he was going to be wearing in the fight. But the guy who did the poster didn't know that. So when the poster arrived, he had the wrong colored trunk. Well, we didn't have the time or the money to do that over again. So I said, listen, when he looks up and he sees that the trunks are the wrong color, we'll have the promoter walking through the empty arena, and he'll complain to the guy that the trunks are the wrong color, and the promoter, David Thayer, Mr. Juergens, will say, oh well, it doesn't really matter, just give us a good fight. And again, this is another reason for us to feel sympathy for Rocky, because nobody cares about the guy, and that's how that scene came to be.
Mm. Well, and just real quick, I'll ask a couple of technical things. And Rocky's famous for the use of Steadicam. I think at the same time was also used in Bound for Glory in some scenes. So how did you hear about this new invention, and how are you able to get it use in the film, since it's such a low budget film?
Well, one of my crew from New York that I had made a number of non-union pictures with was one of the best assistant cameramen I'd ever worked with, Ralph Hotchkiss. And when Ralph heard that we were going to be shooting these scenes in Philadelphia, he said, I have a friend there who had come up with this new camera, and he's got a reel, and he'd like you to look at it. I said, okay, I'd be happy to. So, and at the MGM studio, and here's Garrett Brown's soon-to-be wife running up the stairs of the art museum. And I said, I know just where that will go. And that's how the Steadicam, and at that time it didn't have a name, came to be used in Rocky.
Mm-hmm. And is it true that the shot is actually the shot doing backwards? It was filmed as a zoom out, but it's played as a zoom in. Is that?
Yes. When Rocky's up at the top of the steps, mm-hmm. I shot that originally tight on him and pulled back. And then when I saw it, I thought, now, you know what, that would be a lot better if instead of pulling back, we zoomed in on him. And so we sent it to the lab and said, run this backwards, and that's what they did.
And then how did then the other iconic part of Rocky is the score. So how did I've talked to Bill Conti when I did a show on The Right Stuff, and how did he get involved with with coming up with that iconic?
Well, I had met Bill Conti a couple of years before, and wanted to use him on WW and the Dixie Dance Kings.
Right.
A picture I had done at Fox, and they say, "Oh no, nobody's heard of Bill Conti. We'll give you, excuse me, we'll give you a composer." So when Rocky came along, when Rocky came along, nobody cared who the composer was, and the budget for the music, including everything, including the composer, including the copyist, including the studio rental and the tape for the music to go down on, the studio, everything had to be included in this $25,000 budget.
Mm-hmm.
So when I started working on the boxing, I looked at a lot of boxing pictures and determined that the boxing looked really phony. And realized the only way it was going to look real is if we spent a lot of time rehearsing it. So I convinced the producers to give us that time, at least a couple of weeks of rehearsal before we started shooting the picture, and then put the boxing sequence at the end of the schedule. So we got the Sylvester and Carl in the ring 2 weeks before we started shooting the picture, and they started bouncing around. I had my little 8mm camera, and I said, wait a second. This is going to go on forever. Sylvester, why don't you go home and write this out? Lefts and rights, whatever you want, write it out, and we'll learn that. We'll learn it like a ballet. He liked the idea, came back the next day with 32 pages of lefts and rights, and that's what we learned. And I would shoot the 8mm film of them every day and show it to them a couple of days later, and said, boys, we got to get better, and you might want to lose a little weight. And they practiced and practiced and rehearsed, and that's why it looked so good. And I would take this 8mm footage and show it to Bill, and I'd slow it down in the projector, and I'd play some of Beethoven's Sixth Symphony, the Pastoral, behind it. I said, that music makes it look so much more majestic. So let's have a classic score, and it will move the boxing up. Bill liked that idea, and that's how that music came to be. And instead of just playing the whole thing on the piano, which he could have done, he opted to spend that money on one 3-hour session where we had 30-some piece orchestra that gave us that classical sound. And I remember the producers came into the scoring session, and they saw all these musicians, and they said, Bill, how are you ever going to make any money? But Bill saw the wisdom of giving it that classical sound, and fortunately he held on to the publishing rights, and that's how that came to be.
And so, when in post-production, when you put it together and you finally saw your first, rough cut of it, what was your? Did you know that we actually have a good? Not only do we have a good film here, but this could actually be something big?
No, the realization that I had a hit really occurred to me when I saw a long line around the block in New York when the picture opened. But when we were at that point of looking at the almost final cut, Bill Conti brought in the cue for the last scene, and the music was majestic. It was great, but I didn't have the footage for it. The way the picture was written at the end, the crowd carries out Apollo, and the crowd carries out Rocky, and as Rocky goes by Adrian, he leans over and pulls her up, and the two of them go out on the shoulders of the crowd. So when we were getting ready to shoot that, the crowd carries out Apollo, and the assistant director comes up to me and says, well, we don't have enough people to carry out Rocky. Well, obviously the same people who carried out Apollo were going to carry out Rocky, but Sylvester heard that, and he said, you know what, maybe they don't carry him out. Maybe he just walks out. He lost the fight. He just walks down the aisle. Everybody's gone. Sees Adrian at the end of the aisle, and they join hands, and they walk out. And if you recall, the original poster had the boy and the girl holding hands walking away from the camera.
Right.
So I said, gee, that sounds very poetic. Let's shoot that. And that's what we did shoot. But when Bill brought in that cue for the end of the movie, I didn't have footage to go with that. But the music suggested, it made me think of those old Clairol commercials where the boy and the girl run across the field of wheat and end in an embrace. So I said, let's keep Sylvester in the ring, and we'll have Adrian battle her way through the crowd. She'll climb through the ropes and say, I love you. They'll clinch, and that's the end of the movie. So I convinced the producers of giving us half a day and 25 extras, and Marty Scorsese was about to shoot New York for the same producers, and he had his camera there in their office. So unbeknownst to him, we borrowed his camera and went and shot for half a day that the climatic scene in the ring at the end of Rocky. So it was Bill Conti's beautiful music that inspired that ending. And if it hadn't been for that music, I wouldn't be talking to you right now.
Well, I'll ask this: what do you remember of Oscar night? I mean, that was a pretty. I mean, if people don't remember, that was a pretty stellar class for Best Picture with Rocky, Network, All the President's Men, Taxi Driver, I believe. So what do you remember of Oscar night?
Well, Oscar night was very exciting. I was not imagining that I was going to win, but I remember that afternoon. I thought, Jesus, what if I do win? I've got a lot of people that I owe a lot to, and I want to thank them. I better make some notes just in case. So I wrote down the back of an envelope all the people I wanted to remember in case the long shot came in and my name was called. So I wrote down all these names on the envelope, stuck the envelope in my tuxedo pocket, went off to the ceremony and sat there, which seemed for like ever. And lo and behold, my name is called. So I rush up there and whip out my envelope, and my perspiration had melted the ink, and it looked like a Monet, the envelope. But fortunately, I was able to decipher the names and thanked all the folks that had given me so much of their talent that went into winning that night. But it was great fun, and I highly recommend it to anyone.
Well, and as a postscript, this whole series is now coming out on Blu-ray. As a postscript, just briefly, I'll ask, what was the impetus of your involvement in coming into what at the time was thought to be the final Rocky, I guess Rocky V, and what were the how is that?
Rocky V, Bill Conti came to me and said, Sylvester wants you to do Rocky V. He loses all his money, he goes back to the poor neighborhood, and at the end he dies. And on the way to the hospital in the ambulance, he dies with his head in Adrian's lap, and Adrian comes out of the hospital, and the world's press is assembled, and she announces that Rocky is dead, but as long as people believe in themselves, Rocky's spirit will live forever. And I thought, wow, that sounds terrific. What a great way to go out. So I said yes. So we started shooting the movie, and we shot it in chronological order. So after a week or two of shooting, the head of MGM at the time calls me up, and he says, oh, by the way, Rocky doesn't die. I said, he doesn't die? Why not? He said, well, these people don't die. Superman, James Bond, Spider-Man, these people don't die. So Rocky doesn't die. I said, well, wait a second. Rocky is a fairy tale. He can die, and you can still go on. After he dies, the next picture, he's in limbo. We have to examine Rocky's life to see if he goes to heaven or hell. And it turns out he goes to heaven. And then the next picture, somebody on Earth is in trouble, and guess who comes down from heaven to solve the problem? So he doesn't have to be alive. You can keep doing the sequels. And they said, no, Rocky doesn't die. So Rocky didn't die, but the movie died, because without him dying, there was no point in the movie, because Sylvester wrote the thing with that in mind. Mm-hmm. So it was a very unfortunate decision.
Right. Did you find that when he did Part 6, the real final ending, that he finally was able? Did you feel that he finally was able to come up with a real ending?
Well, I ran into Sylvester a little before he started shooting the
Rocky Balboa.
I don't know if I'm going to call it the last one, and I'll call it the most recent one. I said, so what happens? He said, well, when the movie opens, Adrian's dead. I said, what? Adrian's dead when the movie opens? And he says, yeah. I said, look, if you don't want Adrian in the movie, let her die before the titles. Let her die in your arms. That's an iconic. The two of you are an iconic couple. Her death and you screaming her name into the night, Adrian, and we knowing that she's never going to answer you. That's a great moment. What a way to open the movie. That is, you'll have the audience in the palm of your hand. He said, no. She's dead. So I thought that was a blown opportunity. But for the rest of the movie, I thought it was real good. I was disappointed that he didn't use Sage as his son. Mm-hmm. I thought that was a mistake. Mm-hmm. I said, why aren't you using Sage? He's real good. And he said, he's put on so much weight. I said, so what? I I said, use it. Let Rocky be upset about it. But he didn't see the wisdom of that.
Right.
But I thought the movie up to the fight was good. I thought the fight was a little too glitzy. It wasn't as realistic as I thought it might have been.
Mm-hmm.
But generally speaking, it was a lot better than I thought it was going to be.
Right. Well, I'll ask you. This will be my final question. I'll ask you this, and that, when people talk about, there's all this books have been written about the films of the '70s and the new Hollywood era, and they talk about all the Scorsese, De Palma, Lucas, Spielberg, all those, Altman, all those. But for people who are real connoisseurs of that era, you had your hand in three iconic films. I mean, obviously Rocky, what we're talking about, and we talked earlier about Save the Tiger, and then really in 1970, Joe, which you had a hand in, which is kind of this a real zeitgeist moment of a film. I mean, really coming on. If I remember correctly, it came a little before or after Kent State. I mean, it was kind of a big zeitgeist moment for Joe. So I'm curious, when you look back at
Kent
that.
State was in May of '70, and we shot Joe in January of '70.
Right.
And Joe opened in July of '70.
Yeah, I mean, so Joe really touched a nerve for a lot of people. I mean,
It sure did.
And so I'm curious, when you look at that stuff you did in the '70s, and there's other films in there, what do you think when you look back at that particular period of your career?
I think I was very lucky.
Mm-hmm.
I had the benefit of some terrific scripts. Norman Wexler, who wrote Joe, caught that moment in history very vividly. He and I worked in the advertising business together. That's where we had met, and then we were going to do. I got him to write Serpico,
mm-hmm.
And I was going to do Serpico, but I wouldn't give the producer's girlfriend a job, so I got fired from that. And then I got Norman the job on Saturday Night Fever, which I was going to do, and but I got the boot on that one because of another romantic entanglement with the producer and his boyfriend. But a director is always at the mercy of the script, and
mm-hmm.
I've had the good fortune of having some really terrific scripts, because if it's not in the script, you're out of luck.
Right. And I could ask one quick question, I guess, as something you can, as kind of a post-analysis. Rocky is such an iconic film, and you helped bring that vision to the screen. Do you what is your reaction when you if you read reviews or criticism when some of your other films, they say, well, it's a Rocky-like film? I mean, during the summer I talked to the screenwriter of Karate Kid, and that's another film that and he told me, the producer said, well, this is Rocky for kids, was one of the kind of the pitch of it. And so I was wondering, what do you think when when people describe, well, Avildsen's doing kind of another using kind of a Rocky template? Do you cringe at that, or do you...
I don't think there's any relationship between Rocky and a Karate Kid. Karate Kid was about a kid and a surrogate father. Mr. Miyagi is the perfect fantasy surrogate father. Every kid would like to have a surrogate father like Mr. Miyagi. Mm-hmm. It was a great coming of age story and a great surrogate father-son story. The fact that it, the final scenes of the two movies happen to be in some kind of a sports arena, people like to pigeonhole. So it's convenient. If I had done Serpico, then I would have gotten all the cop movies. So it's just the lack of imagination that some people have.